Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus the Christ. When I was about 8 years old in Germany, we could still play in the rubble from the war because most of the buildings had been destroyed in one way or another. But a group of us found a playing field, a soccer field, which we turned into a soccer field, and we played, and we sort of became a gang. And one of our gang leaders, a guy by the name of Cox, was about 14 years old, and he certainly was the gang leader. Everybody looked up to him. And on one occasion I said to him, Cox, ich will dein Diener sein. Now that translated means, Cox, I want to be your servant or slave. And that wasn't all that bad. I mean, stupid, but it wasn't all that bad. The problem was that my sister heard what I said. And that evening, the whole scenario was replayed for me. And once again I heard, and my father sort of jokingly and kiddingly and jabbingly said to me, Hans, he said, will you be my servant? So would you please get me something? I remember the scene because I was so embarrassed that I would say something like that to another human being. But you know, in many ways, you and I continue to do that. We choose role models for ourselves in our society that in the end will let us down just as Cox eventually let me down. We have the tendency to perhaps point our fingers at a sports figure and we say, aha, that's the kind of person I would like to be. Or perhaps it's a politician that you particularly are fond of because you feel that that politician has done a lot. Probably not, probably a bad example, but I thought I would give it a try. All of us at one time or another choose other human beings as role models for ourselves. And ultimately, regardless of how wonderful that person may appear, ultimately, that person will disappoint us for various reasons, the least of which is that that person is a human being and a sinner just like us. But in our text today, we find that Jesus is telling the disciples that they ought to choose him as a role model. You remember the text? It's not from the Mark chapter that I just read, but from the 13th chapter of John, in which Jesus washes the disciples' feet. It's at the same time as the Mark scenario, but it's just taking a slightly different view of what happened there. Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. Now, let me put that in context. It was very important for rabbis to have followers, people who modeled themselves after the rabbi. And people would. They would seek out a way of attaching themselves to a rabbi, and that rabbi would become their model. And so it was significant at that time that people had chosen Jesus, and Jesus had chosen them. It was significant because Jesus turns out to be their role model, but the typical disciple of a rabbi was required to do an awful lot for the rabbi. But one thing he was never required to do, they drew the line at washing the feet, because that was such a horrible task that was reserved only for slaves. The feet would be dusty if there was no rain. It would be muddy if there was rain, because they had no protection other than sandals, with leather straps that were holding them onto their feet. And then when they went to a room and ate, they would not sit at a table the way you and I sit at a table. They would sit at blocks of solid wood, perhaps 2 feet high, and they would be lying down, resting on their hand or their arm, and the feet of the next person would be right there. And so it was very important when you were sharing a meal that you'd have your feet washed, because they were horribly stinky. And nobody really wanted to be subjected to that. And so the first thing that we have to learn about the context here is that Jesus was in a situation where the disciples had no expectation of what Jesus was going to require of them. And in fact, Jesus broke through and shattered all of their expectations when he decided that he was going to wash their feet. But there's another thing that happened. And that is, for the past several days before this foot washing incident occurred, for the past several days, the disciples, actually for a longer period of time, but with greater intensity, the disciples were arguing amongst themselves who was the greatest. They wanted to sit at the right hand or the left hand of Jesus. They even had the mother come and plead for the sons of Zebedee. They were into a heavy argument with one another as to who was the greatest and who was the best. And so that's the scene. The disciples had no expectation that they would ever be required to wash anybody's feet. And the thought of washing somebody's feet was the farthest thing from their mind, because they were concerned about loftier things, that is, who would be sitting with Jesus in the choice places. And so that's the scene. And within that setting, Jesus now comes and takes off his clothing, except for the loincloth. Takes off his clothing, takes a basin, pours water into it, and he starts to wash their feet. Can you imagine what the disciples must have thought? We know what Peter thought, because he immediately said, "No, you don't have to do that to me. You're not going to do that to me." And Jesus, in a very strong, decisive fashion, says to Peter, "If you're not going to let me wash your feet, it's over. You might as well go." Why? Because Jesus knows, and we all need to know, that whenever we are talking with him, we need to have his forgiveness. We need to face our own frailties and our own sinfulness. And the only way to do that is to allow Jesus to cleanse us from all iniquities, as we just said a few moments ago in the brief order of confession. And washing the feet is both practical and symbolic of that reality. So, Jesus washes the feet, and when he finishes washing the feet, he says when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and I Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done." Now, it's easy at this point for us to go off on a wrong tangent. It's easy for us to think that what Jesus is saying, "Look, I scratched your back, and now you scratch my back." It's easy for us to think that what Jesus is saying is, "I have washed your feet, and now you ought to serve me." But the reality is that Jesus no longer considers them as servants of his. In other words, when you go on and read in the next chapter, we find that Jesus is saying, and we'll come to it in a few moments, Jesus is actually saying, "Hey, look, I want you to serve others." Let me give you a legal example. Let's assume that Carrie has borrowed $100 from me, and she isn't able to pay it back immediately, and I say, "Well, I'll tell you what, you owe me $100, but I'm going to assign my right for those $100 to Paul. And so you don't have to pay me back. What you have to do is pay Paul." That's the nature of the transaction that takes place here. Jesus is saying, "I have washed your feet, and now you go and wash other people's feet, especially the ones that you don't like, especially the enemy. Wash the other person's feet." We belong to a congregation in Columbus, and on Maundy Thursday we actually had a foot washing. And I was not excited about that for several reasons. First reason I wasn't excited about it is that there was a guy in the congregation I did not want to wash his feet. And I didn't want him to touch me. And the other reason I didn't want to is that if I take my shoes and socks off, I have such bad hammer toes that they're just frankly ugly. In fact, one of my sons, when we were playing golf and I was putting on golf shoes, he looked at my toes and he said, "Dad," he said, "that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen." And so here I was at NPC, Northwest Presbyterian Church, and we were going to have our feet washed. And sure enough, the guy that I disliked the most comes over and washes my feet. What do you do at that moment? Well, I just sort of said, "Thank you," and I went over and washed somebody else's feet. I wasn't going to wash his feet. So much for what Jesus says to Hans Scherner. But in any case, we find here that Jesus is saying, what I want you to do is not to be my servant, but to be servants. But to be servants of others. And to be servants of others in a way that allows you to serve that person without any particular recognition. In essence, what Jesus is saying, and what I like to refer to as the 3C Highway. How many of you know what the 3C Highway is here in Ohio? 3C Highway is from Cleveland to Columbus to Cincinnati. Well, the Christian path also has a 3C Highway. It's the one which consists of Christ's conviction, Christ's compassion, and Christ's courage. And we're called to do all of those in the name of Christ, that is to be a servant to others. But let me read you a poem from Ruth Arns Calkin. And she wrote a poem called I Wonder. You know, Lord, how I serve you with great emotional fervor in the limelight. You know how eagerly I speak for you at a woman's club. You know how I shine when I promote a fellowship group. You know my genuine enthusiasm at a Bible study. But how would I react, I wonder, if you pointed to a basin of water and asked me to wash the calloused feet of a bent and wrinkled old woman day after day, month after month, and nobody knew? That's what Jesus is challenging us to do, to be his servant of others. But that's not the only thing that happened that night on Maundy Thursday. The reason we call it Maundy Thursday is because we have a new commandment. The nephew of Dwight L. Moody. Dwight L. Moody was in Chicago, Boston, and all over the world, England, and he was an evangelist, one of the first evangelists. He started an institute, a Bible institute, which is now, I believe, a university called Moody University in Chicago. Karen and I have gone there on numerous occasions to conferences. And Dwight L. Moody, on a particular occasion when they were celebrating Easter, apparently invited his nephew, Brandon Moody, to come there. And in this particular service, they had the Passion Play, which ended with the ascension of Jesus. And the way they had apparently put this thing together, they had ropes around Jesus, and at the end, as he was being pulled, he would be pulled up, and he was pulled up through a hole in the ceiling. But unfortunately, on this occasion, maybe it was the first occasion, on this occasion, the rope broke halfway up. And the man who was playing Jesus fell down. Fortunately, he didn't hurt himself. But he had enough presence of mind. He said, oh, one more thing. He said, don't forget to love one another. Isn't that great? Don't forget to love one another. And in essence, that's what Jesus is saying here. Not only in the washing of the feet, he's saying, I'm giving you a new commandment, a commandment that basically says to love one another. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Tall order, isn't it? You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing. But I've called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father I have made known to you. As I mentioned as I was reading this, it's a tall order. God is a tall order. Why should we believe in him if he weren't? But the question is, how much are you and I going to allow ourselves to be controlled, governed by our Lord? There are so many of us who resist that. There are so many of us who at different times resist God in our lives. We don't want to have much to do with it. And that was captured by Wilbur Rees, who's a Christian author, who wrote, I would like to buy $3 worth of God. Please, not enough to explode my soul or disturb my sleep, but just enough to equal a cup of warm milk or a snooze in the sunshine. I want ecstasy, not transformation. I want the warmth of a womb, not a new birth. I want about a pound of the eternal in a paper sack. I would like to buy $3 worth of God. Please. How many of us settle for $3 worth of God? We don't want to dump God entirely. Just enough to keep him at a comfortable distance. About a sackful of the Almighty. That'll do it. A sackful, nothing more, just enough to keep my guilt level below the threshold of pain, to guarantee escape from eternal flames. I mean, come on. You don't expect me to change my life, do you? I'd like a crowd. Thank you, not a towel. Leave the foot washing for someone